All right. So we're getting into the last 3 weeks of the NFL season, and it's probably one of the most congested playoff fields I think I've ever seen in my, whatever it's been now, like 10, 11 years of watching the NFL. You've got we're 3 weeks left. There's only 6 teams that have actually been mathematically eliminated from the playoffs, which leaves, what is that, 26 teams that all still have a chance to take that last spot. Um, and it's really interesting because there's a lot of teams that are kind of congealed with about the same record. So 4 teams have clinched. We've got the Ravens, Niners, Cowboys, Eagles. They've all clinched. Um, Dolphins, Lions, Chiefs. They haven't clinched yet, but their chance of making the playoffs is very high. Um, but the rest of these teams, it's all up in the air. So we'll just, I don't know how you want to do this, Simon, but I was thinking we could just go through all of the teams that are kind of on the fringe and kind of see what we think about their chances to make it. You want
Yeah.
to start in the AFC or NFC, Simon? What do you think?
Oh. Hmm. I mean, AFC might be a bit more interesting just because there is only one team that's clinched. That's
Yeah,
pretty insane to me at this point. But there is quite a few who are very close.
yeah. So okay, we'll start in the AFC, and we'll start. So out of the teams that are still alive, there's a couple that are Raiders and Chargers are technically still alive, but their chances of actually doing anything with that are pretty slim. Chargers current odds are less than 1%. Raiders current odds are 2. So we'll get them out of the picture to
Yeah,
start.
we don't need to
We'll start with
touch that, but
we don't need to dwell on them. The Broncos. So we'll start with the Broncos. They are very interesting because obviously they had the rough start to the season. They went 1-5 to start, and they've been on a hot streak. But they're coming off a disappointing loss in Detroit. Um, Simon, what do you think about the Broncos potentially making the playoffs? I'll pull up their schedule to see what
yeah,
they're
I was
heading up
doing the
against. Their
same.
last 3 games are Patriots, Chargers, and Raiders, all very winnable games.
That's a good point. Yeah, I mean, that makes me feel a lot better about their odds, actually, considering their opponents for the last couple here. Because, I mean, we just spoke on how the Chargers and Raiders, not very good teams, especially now that the Chargers don't have
Yeah,
Herbert. Raiders just weren't a very good team to begin with. I mean, they have a very easy schedule. This I think the only thing stopping the Broncos at this point is the Broncos. I they just got to they just got to do it. Right? It's as simple as that. They just can't
yeah,
lose a game that they should win. I mean, this
yeah.
has kind of been
And
a comeback year for a lot of players on this Broncos team, including Russell Wilson. It's been
yeah,
very much a bounce back year. So I mean, I would definitely not say they can't do it. I think they've definitely got a very good shot at it. But I guess we'll just have to see how the cookie crumbles on that one. I'm surprised their odds are only 28%.
yeah. I think the biggest thing for them is just the amount of competition that they have because it's when you have so there's in terms of the wild card spots, you got the Browns at 9-5 right now, and then there's a whole bunch of teams at 8-6. Bengals, Colts, Texans, Bills. The tricky thing about the Broncos is that they need at least 2 of those teams to drop a game, and then you have to have the tiebreaker over them.
Hmm.
That's what's kind of tricky about the Broncos, is because they can win all of those games, but unless they see people in front of them start dropping games, it may be out of their control, which is part of why that Lions game was so big. Um,
Yeah.
just because we're getting to the point of the season where you can win out and you can win all your games, but it might not matter just because of what you've done earlier in the season, which kind of sucks for a Broncos team that you're right has been resurgent. Um, so that's the Broncos. They have a decent shot to get in, but they're gonna need some help. We'll move on to the Steelers, who are practically a dead man walking at this point. Their latest game against the Bengals. Um, that if they win, their percentage of making it goes up to 13, but if they lose, they're practically out of it. What
Mason
do you think
Rudolph is
in terms of
starting.
the out? Mason Rudolph is starting. Good point.
Yeah.
What do
Like
you think
it's
is the outlook for them potentially beating the Bengals and then going on? I think they have the Seahawks after that. Do you give them any shot to make the playoffs?
Well, I don't think they're necessarily fighting for the playoffs. I think at this point they're fighting to keep Tomlin's streak alive. I mean,
Yeah.
no, I would not bet on them making it. Because, I mean, they almost have the opposite issue of the Broncos, where their schedule is rough. Like Bengals, Seahawks, Ravens.
Yeah.
Those are three good
Yeah.
teams. Like I think they're gonna run into a bit of a brick wall because I don't think they beat the Bengals. I doubt they beat the Seahawks, and they're definitely not beating the Ravens, unless the Ravens just don't play Lamar or something in the last game or two. Because I mean they've already clinched, so like who knows what could happen
Yeah.
with that? I guess it could just be a last game fluke, but I don't think once we get to that game, I don't think it's gonna matter.
No. And I think the biggest thing for the Steelers is I think they already had their chance. If you look back at their last three games, you talked about how rough their schedule is now. They had an
Yeah,
absolute cakewalk. They lost to the 2-10 Cardinals by 14 points, and then they lost in prime time to the 2-10 Patriots. You lost back to back to 2-win teams. When I think if they won both those games, they're in a playoff spot. You're sitting at 9-5. Even if you lose a couple of these next few games, you're probably getting in. Um, it's really just a testament to. I think the Steelers team have been the biggest frauds. I think they're a lot worse than their 7-7 record says. Um, just because they've been squeaking by, finding ways to win. Mike Tomlin's putting them ahead. Um, I don't know. I don't even know. You're saying they're playing for their streak. I don't even think that is possible for them
no,
to
I don't
win
either.
2 out of their next 3 games.
Yeah.
That's going to be rough.
God, I wonder who would have
Um,
could have predicted at the beginning of the year that Tomlin's streak would end. People doubted me. I had people come up to me and
it's
go,
true.
Simon, that is a terrible take," and I was like, just you watch. There is a graphic on the Instagram. Go check out the Instagram. I am the best NFL analyst in the game, apparently.
I mean, yeah, it looked a little bit rough to start off with how good they were doing, but
Yeah,
they've fallen back to earth, just like you predicted.
yeah.
Speaking
Yeah,
of good
no, I
predictions
definitely,
from
I
our
100% definitely predicted that they lose to the Colts, Patriots, Cardinals, and whoever else they lost to. 100%. That was the exact. Don't go back and watch
I
our
mean,
episode. That's exactly what I said.
we don't need to look into the details. All you said is that the streak would be over, so
That's all I'm
that's all
saying.
we need
Yeah,
to
there
do.
you go.
Um, Speaking of potentially good predictions from our AFC preview show, the Bills are currently sitting outside the playoff picture, which is something that
I think you predicted that.
this one
Yeah,
right here predicted at the start of the season. Not looking too great for me though, because I think the
yeah.
Bills out of any of these teams have one of the best shots to make it.
I mean,
Um, they've had a
they've got a wild probability right now. That's another one. This is a playoff game for them, basically. Like if they win, they have a 70% chance of making. If they lose, they have a 28. The one difference maker in that entire thing is that they're facing the Chargers.
yep. And then after that, they're facing the Patriots, who beat them earlier in the season. It must be said, but I mean, at this point, the Bills are a different team than they were in the first half. That Dolphins
Yeah.
game, at the end of the season will be tough, but I think at that point, they could probably afford to drop one. Um, yeah, it's gonna be fascinating. I think that they've looked significantly better in the last stretch of the year. They had a really rough stretch before, like after that Broncos loss, dropping games to like the Jaguars, Patriots, Bengals. Wasn't looking too hot, but they've just rung off wins against the Chiefs and the Cowboys, two of the best teams in both of their respective conferences, and now have a relative cakewalk schedule that can hopefully. I mean, I don't. As much as I would like to say I was right, and that I predicted the Bills to miss the playoffs, I think they are one of the best 7 teams in the conference, and I think if a team like the Colts or their as much as I love the Bengals, even the Bengals get in ahead of them, that's going to make for less exciting football than if Josh Allen and a Bills team on the rise makes it in. Because if they make it in as a 7 seed, they might be the first 7 seed ever to really make some noise because they are a good team.
Yeah, no, that 8-6 record feels fake. I mean, they've since the start of the year. Sure, they've had a couple bumps in the road, but I think most people figured that the Bills would be one of the best teams in the AFC this year. And just like you said, they definitely are going to have a chance to show that once the playoffs actually come around. But that AFC is rough across the board. Like there's a lot of good teams there. So we'll just have to see what happens. I think it's going to be this is going to be a super exciting playoff, I think, cuz there are a lot of teams that could win it all this year. I think it'll be an interesting one, that's for sure.
And I'm really hoping that teams like the Bills make it in because I do think there's some pretenders in the mix. I don't know how much a Gardner Minshew Colts team is actually going to make noise in the playoffs or a Joe Flacco Browns team. I can't doubt him too much because he's been playing the whole season and they're in a playoff spot right now, which is more than I can say for my team. But yeah, no, like we'll get to them later too. Another
Minshew,
team that's I think
he's had a pretty good year. Yeah, like looking at his stats, honestly,
he has a pretty good year. Has had a pretty good year. Like it's been impressive. Speaking of people who have had a pretty good year in the AFC South, C.J. Stroud and the Houston Texans.
Oh yeah,
probably the biggest surprise of the year. I don't know if anybody saw this coming, even if you were the biggest Stroud supporter to start the year. They are 8-6. Just like you said about the Bills game, this is another one that's like basically a playoff game coming up against the Browns. If they lose their probability, that is a tough game. Their probability will drop to 32% if they lose and 74% if they win. That's pretty stark.
I will say that I think
you gotta hope CJ Stroud's back.
Yeah, I was gonna say. I think if the Texans don't make it this year, I think if the NFL is rigging any games in their so-called script, I think it'll be these next couple ones. Because I think everyone involved just wants the Texans in. Like this has been such a just like storybook season for this Texans team, just all across the board. That I think. I don't know. I think it'd be really disappointing if they somehow didn't make it at this point.
Yeah. It really would be because they've had quality wins against quality teams. They have weird moments where they lose to the Panthers. What's up with that? Or they'll lose to the Jets and make Zach Wilson look like a starting NFL quarterback. They're an interesting team, but I think they're good enough to make noise in the playoffs. They're again beating teams like I think that they beat the Bengals with Joe Burrow, which is no small task. Beating the Broncos, keeping it close against the Jags, lots of good quality wins in there. Beating the Jags earlier in the season by 20 points. Who I don't remember that. They are a good, fun, interesting team. They've had the injury bug hit them a little bit. Stroud didn't play the last game with Case Keenum kind of keeping their season alive. But if he's back, that game against Cleveland, it'll definitely be one of the better games of the week. And I think the Browns are looking a little bit better because they have a game up, so they'll probably make it no matter what. But with Joe Flacco at quarterback, you don't really know. That could just be a straight up playoff game in terms of who's getting in and who's not.
Or Joe Flacco goes all the way and wins his second Super Bowl.
It's not entirely out of the realm of possibility.
Wouldn't that be just lovely?
Oh yeah. We'll move on to who we were talking about earlier with Gardner Minshew and the Colts. Yeah. Probably one of the biggest surprises of the year.
I'd argue a bigger surprise. Especially I can definitely say when Anthony Richardson went down, I thought this Colts team would be dead in the water.
Yeah, because who would have thought that with somebody like Gardner Minshew they could pull anything like this off? But they've been such a gritty team. They've been staying in games.
And they've got a fairly good roster. Like that's something that not a lot of people talked about at the beginning of the year. Like they have a lot of very skilled players. I think I don't think it should be as surprising as it kind of was to see Gardner Minshew, who's kind of just a field man. Like he can just go out there and just like use what he's got and he's going to make it work. Like, I think
Mhm.
this is, I don't know. I don't think it should be as surprising as it is kind of what I'm saying. Like, they're just
Yeah.
making,
Uh,
making it work with what they've been given.
and a lot of it is coaching too, with
Yeah, that too.
Shane Steichen coming in. Because you're right, they do have a talented roster, but this is also pretty much the same roster that Frank Reich had last year, and they kind of um, fell off extremely hard at the end of the year last year. So for Shane Steichen to come in and elevate this team without that kind of franchise quarterback that they had for the first few games, it's been extremely impressive. They've won, looking at this, they've won 5 out of their last 6. Not all of them were world beaters kind of opponents, but um, all still quality wins. Some against teams that are in playoff position right now, like the Bucks or the Steelers. Um, yeah, no, it's going to be interesting. The next 3 games are relatively easy. They've got the Raiders, the Falcons, and then they've got the Texans game at the end of the year that'll probably decide who makes the playoffs and who doesn't. Um, Going to be really interesting to see how this plays out for the Colts down the stretch. We'll move on to another team that is surprising, perhaps for the not for the reasons that you might think. The Bengals, who obviously, I mean, the Bengals were my Super Bowl pick at the start of the year, so it's not like it's surprising that they're here. But for them to be there with Jake Browning is kind of the surprising factor. I don't know if you've watched any Jake Browning football recently, Simon, but
You know,
they've looked pretty good, and it doesn't seem like they've taken that much of a step back from Burrow, which is surprising to say the least.
yeah, no, I can't say I have because I have not had a lot of time to watch a lot of NFL, but I have heard about it. I think that it is insanely impressive that what he's been able to go out there and do. And if he can keep it up, I mean, sky's seriously the limits with this Bengals team. At least in my opinion, I think that they can go far. It's just whether I don't know when you're playing with a quarterback as inexperienced as Browning is, at least in this position. I think that it is going to be pretty interesting to say the least to see what ends up happening.
Yeah, and he's proven himself time and time again since he's come in the lineup.
And he's going to have to keep doing
Because
it.
he's gonna have to keep doing it, especially with how many teams we've gone through already in the AFC. Like you can tell, this is a crowded field. Um, but you've got teams in his. I believe he started 4 games, lost to the Steelers to start, but since then he's rattled off wins against 3 teams, all of which are currently in the playoffs. Jaguars in overtime, Bengals by 20 points, Vikings in overtime. Those are good quality wins. And it's a tough schedule for the Bengals. This is probably their biggest hurdle. They play the Steelers, which is probably a win.
That's a win.
But they're still technically in playoff contention. Um, but then they've got the Chiefs and the Browns to finish the season.
Ooh, that's rough.
I think if they can pull off one or both of those games, then my camera goes falling to the ground. I think if they can pull off one or both of those games, they're in.
No, I don't disagree. I think it's a similar. They're in a pretty interesting spot where it is completely surrounding Jake Browning. That's the
Yeah.
story, right? It's you like I said, he's gonna have to keep proving himself. Can he win in this position? Can he win in that position? Can he win in the playoffs? That is going to be the story for the Bengals for the rest of the season. Like I think, and if he can prove everyone wrong, like it's with the type of season that he's had. I mean, he's kind of setting himself. I'm assuming he's not signed to more than a 1-year deal. If he goes out there, is he?
Yeah, it's a little bit weird. I believe he's an exclusive rights free agent, so he's technically a free agent, but like the Bengals have first dibs essentially in terms of re-signing him, kind of like an RFA in the NHL kind of thing.
Okay, yeah, I think I know what you mean. I was gonna say though, what's the chances the Bengals actually want to bring him back? Obviously, they have Burrows. Like, I think there's a good chance he could go somewhere else if he goes out there and continues to play the way he's playing. So
Yeah.
I think he's playing for a contract right now or a future contract. I don't know where that would be and what that would necessarily mean, but I think if he can keep it up, he's making a career for himself this season. So I think, and there's a few quarterbacks this season that are doing that. I think it's pretty insane when you look across the especially in the AFC. I mean, Gardner Minshew, Browning. We've got Joe Flacco for some reason on a 9-5 team. Like, it's pretty weird right now.
Yeah. And we can move on to the NFC now, but like because we won't go into the Jags and Browns because they're probably gonna make it. If they win, if the Browns win, they're pretty much in. And if the Jags win, they go to almost 90%.
Yeah.
Um, but it'll be interesting. If the Jags lose or the Browns lose, then it becomes a conversation. But we'll move on to the NFC. NFC is a little bit less crowded.
Yeah.
We've got I'd say about the Packers and Falcons have kind of played themselves out of the conversation. Currently, the Packers sit at about 18%, Falcons at 11. They've kind of fallen off in recent weeks, but I think it comes down to about four teams that are competing for the last two spots, and that's the Saints, the Seahawks, the Rams, and the Vikings. We'll start with the Saints, who just lost on Thursday night to the Rams. What do you think about this Saints team in terms of where they stand? They're currently at a 22% chance of making the playoffs. Do you
Well,
think,
they've
especially in a
been.
weak division, do you think they have a shot?
Yeah. That is the thing. They are in probably the weakest division. Who's leading that division right now? Is it them?
Tampa.
Tampa. Oh yeah, I guess. I mean, they need to beat Tampa out. I think that's the, or at least they. I think. Am I right on that?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Tampa. They play Saints versus Bucks. Will happen next week.
Okay. Yeah, I think they
Um,
need to beat out Tampa. I think to make it. So I think that'll be, and I do think that Tampa's probably the better team, and I don't think it's that close. I think. I mean, the Saints are 7-8, so they can't be that bad. But I wouldn't necessarily go out on a whim and say I like their odds of making the playoffs.
yeah, they need to win out. Like it's not a question. They need to win out. That game against the Rams was pretty crucial. I think that game against the Rams, you're right, kind of killed any chance of them getting in as a wild card team. They kind of have to win their division now. Beat the Bucks and then beat the Falcons and hope the Bucks drop a game to the Jags this week, which is possible. Then they can definitely make in, but they really do need a lot of specific things to go right. Um, we'll move on. We'll move on to my team. Um, which I honestly think the outlook is a whole lot better than it once was. We're sitting at a solid, pretty much 50% chance of making it as of right now. But I think our schedule kind of gives us a little bit of an upper hand. We've got the Titans, the Steelers, and the Cardinals to end the season. Those are all very winnable games. And we
Yeah.
just came off a win against probably the second or third best team in the conference now, the Eagles, um, with Drew Lock at quarterback. We're getting Geno Smith back. If we can go on a roll and win all these three games, I think we're in. I think
Yeah.
we're in. I think this Seahawks team has been incredibly disappointing this year. Um, their two losses to the Rams are definitely the worst of their entire season, and because the Rams have the tiebreaker and are also in contention for that wild card spot, it could be the thing that ends their season. We could very well have had our season die on a missed Jason Myers field goal at SoFi Stadium a month ago. But I think we definitely have a shot, and I could see we'll get to the Vikings later, but I could see the Seahawks and Rams both making it. And I think if I were to give a guess today, that would probably be what I'd say. What about you, Simon? Do you feel more positive than not about the
Um.
Seahawks making the playoffs with that kind of schedule?
I mean, I do. I definitely think they can go 10-7 to finish the year. They can win out. That's not a question to me. I think it's more surrounding what the Rams do. The Rams and just because if the Rams win out, Like, what's their schedule look like?
If the Rams went out, their schedule is because they just beat the Saints, so they only have 2 games left, and I believe one of them is against the Niners. The other one I don't remember who it was, but it was a pretty cakewalk
It's
game from what I can remember. The Giants,
They
the
have the
Giants.
Giants
So
this upcoming week, and then they have the 49ers. Yeah. So, yeah, it's just up to whether they can win out. Because I think they. Do you think they beat the 49ers?
that I think honestly that depends on the game that happens on Christmas Day. If the Ravens beat the Niners and that number one seed in the NFC is still up for grabs, I think the Niners will beat the Rams because they will be playing their starters. If the Niners beat the Ravens, I think they have that number one seed in the NFC locked up, and I think they rest their starters for that last game, and I think the Rams win. I think that kind of strangely, that 49ers Ravens game kind of means a lot for the lower part of the NFC playoff picture, as kind of contradictory as it is.
Yeah, no, I can see that. I mean, I don't disagree with your take on the fact that you could see 3 teams out of the NFC West make it. I think that
Yep.
is there's a good chance that ends up happening just because of how easy the Seahawks schedule is. But like you mentioned, this team has been disappointing. What's the odds that they just lose a game they should have won? Like, what's the odds they just drop one of
Yep.
these games and it's just that's it?
It's
Because
definitely a possibility, and I could see it happening, which is the scary part.
yeah,
Um, I do think they still have a chance to get in, even if that does happen, because of the team that we can talk about next, the Vikings. So, out of the three, because we've talked about the Saints, I think they definitely still have a shot to make it in as a wild card if they win out, but it's mostly they're contending for the division. So it's really 3 teams that have a shot to take the final 2 wild card spots. So someone's going to be the odd one out. And I think even if the Seahawks drop one, it's going to be the Vikings. The Vikings' current schedule contains 2 games against the Lions. They have to play the Lions twice.
that's rough.
The chances that they will sweep the Lions is very low. So even if the Rams win out or they drop one against the Niners and the Seahawks also drop one, so the Rams are above the Seahawks, I think the Seahawks will beat out the Vikings just because of how tough that schedule is. Because the other game the Vikings have is against the Packers. Not a cakewalk. Not a cakewalk at all.
Yeah,
So
I don't know.
that's kind of where it's sitting. It looks to me the NFC playoff picture looks a lot clearer than the AFC one does. The AFC one, you have about 7 or 8 teams that can fit the final 2 spots. In the NFC, it's about 3 to 4, and I think the Vikings are currently looking really rough unless they can turn it on in the last little bit. But if they can turn it on, then they control their own destiny. If they win all 3, they're in.
Yep.
They're in.
No, I don't think I have much to add on to that. I pretty much agree with you. I think that the chances of them beating Detroit twice is rough. I think that there's a better chance Detroit sweeps them than the Vikings sweeping Detroit. I think so. I don't know. I don't necessarily like their odds, but like you said, yeah, they can do it. If they somehow pull something out of their ass, they can do it. So
Yeah. Which I'm really hoping they don't, frankly. I was so happy that the Bengals won that game against the Vikings. Like that was a great game. I loved every second of that. But um I think that's about it for the NFL playoff picture. I mean, there's some other team like we could talk about the Bucks, but I think they've got a pretty clear shot at winning that division. Otherwise, I think it's pretty much set. But it's going to be a very interesting last 3 weeks, like definitely. And thankfully, I don't have any more school or anything to restrain me from being
that's
a
true.
degenerate and sitting on my couch for 9 hours and watching Red Zone. Like this is the perfect. This is the most wonderful time of the year, and not because of Christmas, but because of NFL football. Thank you, Mr. Goodell. You truly bring the Christmas.